This is preface of book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. When I was 13 years old, my father died. He developed lung cancer in his 50s, which left him bedridden for a year before it finally killed him. He was a humble and decent man who encouraged me to think more deeply about life. I was totally unprepared for his death, and I coped with it badly. I became angry and depressed. I to stay out all night playing cat and mouse with the local cops, breaking into buildings and waiting for them to arrive so I could run into gardens and dive over hedges and fences to lose them. I was always in trouble, either for skipping lessons at school, arguing with my teachers, or getting in fights with my classmates. As soon as my 16th birthday came around, I was marched briskly down to the headmaster's office and given two choices: either leave voluntarily or be expelled. So I left, and I was subsequently placed in a special program for troubled kids. I felt that my life was spiraling rapidly out of control. I had been labeled a write-off by school and social services. I didn't really see any point trying to prove them wrong. Each evening my father would come home from his work as a digger driver on building sites and collapse exhausted in an armchair, hands covered in grease and dirt. The job didn't pay well, and he hadn't 2 pennies to rub together, but he never complained. When he was a young man, his best friend had passed away, leaving my father a farm in his will to everyone as surprise. He refused the bequest, returning the land to the other man's family. He used to say, "Money won't to bring you happiness," and he really believed that. He showed me that there are more important things in life, and that true wealth comes from being contented with whatever you have rather than desiring to have more and more. After my father's funeral, my mother placed his old leather wallet on the dining room table and told me to take it. I opened it slowly. I think my hands were shaking, but I am not sure why. Inside there was nothing except a badly worn scrap of paper. It turned out to be a passage he torn from the book of Exodus. "And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you." I was desperate to understand what on earth those words could possibly have meant to him. My own philosophical journey began precisely at that moment, as I stood there perplexed, with that piece of paper in my hand. When I learned many years later that Marcus Aurelius had lost his father at an early age, I wondered if he'd been left searching in the same way I had for a sense of direction. After my father's death, I was left with religious and philosophical questions that troubled me very deeply. I remember being terrified of dying. I would lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, trying to solve the riddle of existence and find some consolation. It was as though I had an itch at the back of my brain that I needed to scratch but couldn't quite reach. I didn't know it at the time, but that sort of existential anxiety is a common experience that drives people to the study of philosophy. The philosopher Spinoza, for example, wrote, "I thus perceived that I was in a state of great peril, and I compelled myself to seek with all my strength for a remedy, however uncertain it might be, as a sick man struggling with a deadly disease, when he sees that death will surely be upon him unless a remedy be found, is compelled to seek such a remedy with all his strength, inasmuch as his whole hope lies therein." I took the phrase, "I am that I am," to refer to the pure awareness of existence itself, which at first seemed like something deeply mystical or metaphysical to me. I am the consciousness of my own existence. It reminded me of the famous inscription from the Delphic oracle shrine, "Know thyself." That became one of my maxims. I grew quite obsessed with the pursuit of self-knowledge, through meditation and all forms of contemplative exercises. I found out later that the passage my father carried with him all those years plays an important role in the rites of a Masonic chapter called the Royal Arch. During initiation, the candidate is asked, "Are you a Royal Arch Mason?" To which he replies, "I am." Freemasonry has a long history in Scotland, going back at least 4 centuries, and it has deep roots in my home there. My father and many of my friends' fathers were members of the local lodge. Most Freemasons are Christians, but they employ non-denominational language, referring to God as the great architect of the universe. According to the legend presented in some of their texts, a set of spiritual teachings originating with the builders of King Solomon, as temple was brought to the West by the philosopher Pythagoras, and further disseminated by Plato and Euclid. This ancient wisdom was reputedly handed down through the centuries by medieval Masonic lodges. They used esoteric rituals, geometric symbols such as the square, and compasses to convey their spiritual doctrines. Freemasonry also celebrates the four cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy, which correspond symbolically with the four corners of the lodge: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, if you prefer more modern terms. My father took these ethical teachings seriously, and they shaped his character in a way that left a lasting impression on me. Freemasonry, at least for sincere practitioners like my father, didn't represent the bookish sort of philosophy taught in the ivory towers of universities, but rather something derived from a much older conception of Western philosophy as a spiritual way of life. As it happened, I wasn't old enough to become a Freemason, and with my reputation around town I wouldn't have been invited to join anyway. So, with negligible formal education behind me, I began reading everything I could about philosophy and religion. I am not sure I would have even been able to articulate exactly what I was looking for at that time, except that it would have to somehow combine my interests in philosophy, meditation, and psychotherapy. I needed a more rational, philosophical guide to life, but nothing seemed to fit the bill. Then I had the good fortune to encounter Socrates. I had been studying the collection of ancient Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, which are inflected with Greek philosophy. This led me to begin reading the Platonic dialogues, which portray Socrates, the quintessential Greek philosopher, questioning his friends and other interlocutors about their deepest values. He tended to focus on the cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy, later adopted by Freemasons. Socrates didn't write any books on philosophy. We know about him only through the works of others, mainly dialogues written by two of his most famous students, Plato and Xenophon. According to legend, Socrates was the first person to apply the philosophical method to ethical questions. He particularly wanted to help others to live wisely, in accord with reason. For Socrates, philosophy was not only a moral guide but also a kind of psychological therapy. Doing philosophy, he said, can help us overcome our fear of death, improve our character, and even find a genuine sense of fulfillment. The Socratic dialogues are often notoriously inconclusive. Indeed, Socrates' insistence that he knew nothing about certain matters, referred to as Socratic irony, later inspired the tradition known as Greek skepticism. Nevertheless, he appears to have communicated positive teachings to his students about the best way to live. The cornerstone of these is captured in a famous passage from Plato's Apology. Socrates faces the trumped-up charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, which would lead to his execution. Rather than apologize, though, or plead for mercy and parade his weeping wife and children before the jury as others did, he just carries on doing philosophy by questioning his accusers and lecturing the jury on ethics. At one point, he explains in plain language what it means to him to be a philosopher. For I go around doing nothing but persuading both young and old among you not to care for your body or your wealth in preference to or as strongly as for the best possible state of your soul. As I say to you, wealth does not bring about virtue, but virtue makes wealth and everything else good for men, both individually and collectively. That's how he'd individuate that example. We are to place more importance upon wisdom and virtue than anything else. A philosopher, in Socrates' sense, is therefore a person who lives according to these values, someone who literally loves wisdom, the original meaning of the word. Looking back, I realize that I turned to Socrates and other ancient philosophers to find a philosophy of life like the one my father had found in Freemasonry. However, as mentioned earlier, the surviving dialogues typically portray Socrates as method of questioning rather than providing a detailed practical account of the Socratic art of living wisely. While the ancient philosophers didn't provide me with the practical answers I was looking for back then, they did inspire me to read further. My newfound sense of purpose also helped me to get my life back on track. I stopped getting in trouble and enrolled to study philosophy at university in Aberdeen. I noticed, though, that something wasn't right. The way we approached the subject was too academic and theoretical. The more time I spent in the basement of the library poring over books, the further away I seemed to be drifting from Socrates' original conception of philosophy as a way of life, something that could improve our character and help us flourish. If ancient philosophers were veritable warriors of the mind, their modern counterparts had become more like librarians of the mind, more interested in collating and organizing ideas than putting philosophy to work on a daily basis as a psychological practice. Upon graduating, I began studying and training in psychotherapy because learning to help others seemed to offer me a route to self-improvement that I could relate to my studies in philosophy. It was a time of transition for the therapy field. Freudian and Jungian psychoanalytic approaches were slowly giving way to cognitive behavioral therapy, which has since become the dominant form of evidence-based practice in psychotherapy. Ket was closer to the philosophical practice I was looking for, because it encourages us to apply reason to our emotions. However, it is something you typically do for a few months and then set aside. It certainly doesn't aim to provide us with a whole way of life. Modern therapy is necessarily more modest in scope than the ancient Socratic art of living. Most of us these days are looking for a quick solution to our mental health problems. Nevertheless, once I started working as a psychotherapist, it became evident to me that most of my clients who suffered from anxiety or depression benefited from the realization that their distress was due to their underlying values. Everyone knows that when we believe very strongly that something very bad has happened, we typically become upset as a result. Likewise, if we believe that something is very good and desirable, we become anxious when it threatened or sad if it has already been lost. For example, in order to feel social anxiety, you have to believe that other people, the negative opinions of you, are worth getting upset about, that it's really bad if they dislike you, and really important to win their approval. Even people who suffer from treasure trove of spiritual practices, tucked away in the literature of Greek and Roman philosophy, which were clearly designed to help people overcome emotional suffering and develop strength of character. Hadot discovered that contemplative practices became very common in the philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period, a few generations after the death of Socrates. The Stoic school in particular focused on the practical side of Socratic philosophy, not only through the development of virtues such as self-discipline and courage, what we might call emotional resilience, but also through extensive use of psychological exercises. Something puzzled me, though. Hadot compared these philosophical practices to early Christian spiritual exercises. As a psychotherapist, I spotted immediately that most of the philosophical or spiritual exercises he identified could be compared to psychological exercises found in modern psychotherapy. It very soon became evident to me that Stoicism was, in fact, the school of ancient Western philosophy, with the most explicitly therapeutic orientation and the largest armamentarium or toolbox of psychological techniques at its disposal. After scouring books on philosophy for over a decade, I realized that I'd been looking everywhere except in the right place. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, the psalm. As I began to devour the literature on Stoicism, I noticed that the form of modern psychotherapy most akin to it was rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, the main precursor to C, first developed by Albert Ellis in the S. Ellis and Aaron II. Beck, the other main pioneer of SEED, had both cited Stoic philosophy as the inspiration for their respective approaches. For instance, Beck and his colleagues had written in The Cognitive Therapy of Depression, the philosophical origins of cognitive therapy can be traced back to the Stoic philosophers. Indeed, Keat and Stoicism have some fundamental psychological assumptions in common, particularly the cognitive theory of emotion, which holds that our emotions are mainly determined by our beliefs. Anxiety largely consists of the belief, for example, that something bad is going to happen, according to Beck. From shared premises, moreover, Stoicism and Keat were bound to arrive at similar conclusions about what sort of psychological techniques might be helpful to people suffering from anxiety, anger, depression, and other problems. One Stoic technique particularly caught my attention. Although it is well attested in the ancient sources, there is very little mention of anything like the view from above, as Hadot called it, in modern psychotherapy or self-help literature. It involves picturing events as though seen from high overhead, as they might be seen by the gods atop Mount Olympus, perhaps. Broadening our perspective often induces a sense of emotional equanimity. As I practiced it myself, I noticed, as Hadot did, that it brings together a confluence of themes central to ancient philosophy in a single vision. I also found that it was easy to turn it into a guided meditation script. As I was now training psychotherapists myself and speaking at conferences, I was able to guide rooms full of experienced therapists and trainees, up to 100 at a time, through my version of the exercise. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that they took to it instantly, and it became one of their favorite exercises. They would describe how they were able to remain exceptionally calm while contemplating their situation in life from a detached perspective. I began sharing my resources online via my personal blog. In America, the marketer and entrepreneur Ryan Holiday embraced Stoicism in The Obstacle is the Way and The Daily Stoic, co-authored with Stephen Hanselman. In the UK, the illusionist and television celebrity Darren Brown later published a book called Happy, which drew inspiration from the Stoics. These authors were reaching a whole new audience far beyond academia and introducing it to Stoicism as a form of self-help and a philosophy of life. The scientific skeptic and professor of philosophy Massimo Pigliucci published How to Be a Stoic in the same year. Republican politician Pat McGahan released Stoicism and the State House. Stoicism was also being used in the military as part of Colonel Thomas Jarrett as warrior resilience training. The naval executive and former New England Patriots coach Michael Lombardi embraced it, and the philosophy began to gain more and more adherents from the world of sports. Stoicism was clearly experiencing a resurgence in popularity, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. Online communities for Stoics were flourishing, attracting hundreds of thousands of members across the internet.